Fantastic. So, first of all, thanks again for coming on to Breaking Ground. This is the second year that we are running with this, and a lot of the project has changed in that time because time itself has changed over that period as well. But I guess the important thing to start with is that I'm just really, passionate about this type of work, really. From being a freelancer myself, I'm an actor, I've been doing that for about 20 years. And I think from working in that environment and working in a freelance way over that time, I've noticed the difficulties and I've noticed the cracks that appear that we can often fall through as well. So I'm particularly passionate about empowering, I guess, other creatives and other freelancers as well to take a more self-directed approach towards our careers. And that's really what Breaking Ground is fundamentally about, really. I'm also a coach, a qualified and credentialed one, and the coaching that I do focuses specifically on creative careers as well. So working with freelancers on their career management, their development, and pretty much how to move forward in a way that is sustainable, which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but we'll come back to what I look at that as meaning. Just to share, some of these comments came as in light of some research that was done recently on artist development in Manchester. But reading them, it kind of sparked in my own head a lot of the things that I think about what is needed from artists in relation to professional development, but also what I hear from people coaching as well. And I think there's a little bit of a difference to what is being said here in relation to what often we focus on in professional development for creatives. So notions of success and value in artists' careers are unfixed and unvaried. So fundamentally, what we're doing in Breaking Ground is we're taking a very individual perspective on career development because we all want different things in our careers and in different ways. No one artist wants to work in the same way as another. No one actor wants the same type of success as another. So fundamentally, we need to find a way of working with individual artists that really recognizes the fact they are individual. The artists, the measure of success they took as their benchmark was being able to continue as artists. Fundamentally, I think for us, it's about how can we stay in the game of what we do, doing the things we're passionate about, but in a way that doesn't have a massive cost on the rest of our life, ideally in a way that supports the rest of our life as well. And I think this version of sustainability is what I, for one, I'm definitely looking for as a freelance creative, but I think most of us really tie in with that idea too. And this other statement rung some bells for me too. For artists, measures of success were far more personal than validatory factors applied by arts organizations. So there is a perception of the way in which maybe artists should develop, which can be quite different from the way in which we might want to, and they can take different directions. But Breaking Ground specifically is looking from an artist-centered perspective in relation to this. And that's what this whole project and the way I'm working is about. So here is the fundamental question that I'm bringing to Breaking Ground, but I think it's one that we'll all resonate with. So how do we construct more meaningful, productive, and sustainable careers? The last two of those have become sort of buzzwords, especially in relation to, I guess, the pandemic over the last 2 years. But in general, I guess, productivity and sustainability are words we hear a lot of talk about. I was going to add the question of, is sustainability a problem in the arts to this slide? But I took it away because it feels self-evident that it is. We know it's always been a challenge being freelance, but there are newer ways of approaching it. But the addition I've made to this particular question is meaningful. I think we often neglect this, especially when we're looking at career development or work in the arts from more of a top-down societal perspective. We miss that actually for something and someone to be productive and to have a sustainable career, it needs fundamentally to be meaningful to that individual. So on Breaking Ground, we start at the idea of meaningful. And that's different for every individual. So part of the way that this is set up and the part of the way that Breaking Ground works is about affording us the time and the individual scope to really identify for ourselves what is meaningful and what's becoming more meaningful, because that changes over time. But that is fundamentally the question that we're looking to answer in Breaking Ground. And we'll show some of the feedback from last year's Breaking Ground at the very end of this. And a lot of these elements, comes up in the feedback as being boxes that were ticked for individuals that were present on that previous one too. So these are the aims of the project. which you'll probably forget about as we go through it. But it's good to outline what these are to a degree. And these are aligned with the Irish Arts Council's Making Great Artwork, Great Work Art. I forget the title. The current one that they have in relation to 2025 for the overall development of the art sector. They're aligned to it because actually a lot of it plays into how I view artist development, but also the experience that I've had working one-to-one with people as well. So the three aims are essentially about increasing our own sense of personal agency, awareness, and creative potential. Awareness is the key element there for me, in that unless we have the time to really identify for ourselves what is missing, what is wanted, what is needed, we don't really get to extend that personal agency or indeed push out that creative potential. And the way in Breaking Ground that we do it is looking at, well, what's at the edge of where we are now? What is the interests that I have, the curiosities that I have, and how can I use this time on Breaking Ground to push into those, to begin to explore them? So that's how we look at that first aim. The second aim, develop new and enhanced organizational and strategic skills to support productive and sustainable artists' careers. A fun sentence to say. But to break that down for us in Breaking Ground, what it really means is taking the opportunity to deconstruct the way that we think about our careers and the way that we go about our work. Look at some tools, some strategies that have a good evidence base to them, and then reconstruct the way that we might choose to go on in our careers or indeed our practice. Typically, we don't do this really because we're quite busy in real life. So taking the time out to reflect on what isn't working is not a luxury we're often afforded or an opportunity given often either. So Breaking Ground is the opportunity to do that. And the way it's structured as well is very much in line with that idea of deconstructing and then reconstructing it. And finally, and this is one of the most fun for me, is creating a space for collaborative, cross-disciplinary, peer-to-peer learning and artistic development. One of the things that comes across, I think, from the last Breaking Ground and from all of the work that I do with creatives in relation to a group environment, something that is the most beneficial aspect is the other perspectives of other artists in the room. So listening to a visual artist or to a musician talk about the same challenges that you might face as a writer, as a freelancer, is really insightful, really opens up the mind as to what might be possible in ways that I guess people in your line of work might not necessarily think is applicable. Also, the group nature of it is just really good to have a sense of community in this particular work. It gives that sense of accountability of meeting each week. Breaking Ground runs over 6 weeks consecutively, but having a group to actually move through this with, who are having the same questions at the same time as you, is really productive. And also, I think fundamentally, we don't have a space really as freelancers working in the arts to be able to talk about what it is to work in the arts in this way, to be able to talk about our career development. An actor I recently spoke to refer to it as the secret sauce that no one really talks about in relation to how you make things work. And Breaking Ground creates a space for us to have a talk about that secret sauce to a degree, to see what works for ourselves, what works for others, and really explore that. And I think that is something that is missing a lot for us, really. So those are the aims of what we're looking to do in Breaking Ground. And well, how do we go about doing it? What makes Breaking Ground as an artist development project different? And the first thing is something I've already alluded to, and it's the artist-centered nature of Breaking Ground and how it works. All artist development surely is artist-centered. Most of it is to a degree. But if we look at the other side of the spectrum, we would look at more of a societal centered perspective. So looking at maybe what an arts council or government might decide might be best for artists might be different from what you would want your individual self to want as an artist. So taking this perspective means we ask slightly different questions in relation to our development. So one of those questions might be, for example, what is the emotional experience I want to have in my career doing the work that I do? That is really crucial and essential as a freelance creative artist. It's not such an important question for someone taking a more systemic perspective or a more societal one. How do I want my career to be over the course of a lifetime, as opposed to just on a project-to-project basis? So taking the artist-centered perspective in relation to this means we work in a much more bespoke way with each person. Other questions in relation to the artist-centered thing might be, well, what other areas of who I am and what I do might I want to explore that might even be outside of that more artist, the more traditional things that I would be expected to do as an artist. So there's a lot more room for us to work in that personal way from that perspective. It's holistic, which sounds like a lovely word. And this is, I guess, this cuts across a few different planes in the training. So one of them is the idea that actually for us as creatives, our life and work aren't necessarily separate. I think it's a bit of an industrialist's lie that we can compartmentalize work and life quite neatly, separately. Breaking Ground very much looks at the idea that not so much that we need to balance the two, but we need to integrate the two. I can spend my entire day in a rehearsal for a play and then go to watch another play at night, and that's perfectly fine for me. But from a life-work balance perspective, for someone else, they might say that that's too much. I think most of us as creatives want our lives and our profession to intermix in some way, or at least to fuel each other. So we're taking that perspective. We also look at the holistic perspective in relation to you as a human being. Your career and the way in which you work in the arts isn't just the work you make or the skills you have or the things you do. It's also how you feel about the work you do and the skills you have. It's how you think about them as well. It's the overall beliefs and assumptions that you might have about yourself and the work that you're doing. We get all of that with the holistic perspective, which we miss when we don't take that as perspective. So Breaking Ground, fundamentally, the tools we use and the strategies and the approaches we take looks at both sides of that as we go through it as well. Relevant to modern creative careers. About 93% of the research that's been published on careers has been published in the last 30 years. And by careers, I'm talking about organizational psychologists talking about the world of work and how we best fit into it. So that pretty much points to the idea that if whatever ideas we might have in our heads about career counselors of old or career coaches or I guess career theory and how maybe not important it might be to a creative, those ideas probably come from stuff that's been written in 1911 or 1950. We have much more relevant information now because the attention has been put over the last couple of years specifically to how people work best when they're crossing networks and shifting roles continually over time. So we've got some really, I think, useful tools and strategies now that we didn't have before in relation to that. That's particularly useful for freelancers, and Breaking Ground works within that, and we'll have a little overview of how we work with that in this presentation too. Critical and reflective. Critical but not judgmental. So Breaking Ground is about allowing us to see some of our own blind spots. This is something that we can't do well by ourselves. We can't really, for ourselves, identify the patterns that we're repeating over the course of our work or our careers. We can't really identify often the things that might be limited perspectives that we might have on what we could do. We really need either someone else or a group of others to help us see that. And in Breaking Ground, the group environment in this training really helps with that. Hearing how another artist has dealt with the same challenge that we're facing and moved through it successfully kind of enforces me to acknowledge that there is another way of doing it. But the thing that I thought wasn't possible was. So we get that critical perspective in that group environment, but also in the one-to-one coaching element, which is also a part of this training program as well. It's reflective. And this points to what I was mentioning a little bit earlier about the idea that in order for us to shift and change in any way, we need time to actually step out of the practice that we're working in, the way that we're working as creatives, to reflect upon it from a distance and ask those questions of what's working and what's not. Breaking Ground is the invitation, I guess, to choose to do that. Typically, I think Freud wrote this, but typically we don't get reflective about our careers or lives until we reach a crisis point. So until we're really stuck, we tend not to ask these questions. So if you found yourself reflecting on what was important about being in the arts or not, or what you wanted to change during the pandemic, that would be in line with Freud's thinking in relation to that. And the suggestion here with Breaking Ground is that we don't have to wait for a crisis to do that. That the more we can bring in a reflective practice to the way we work, actually the more we can navigate the natural shifts and changes that happen within our career the whole time. But Breaking Ground gives us that opportunity and some of the tools as well about that reflective practice. Research and evidence-based. It's important for me to say that the work that Breaking Ground is based on, the ideas, the strategies, and the tools are not mine. I'm not a psychologist. I'm an actor. I might be qualified as a coach and I can apply some of these in that work, but I haven't originated them. I think what's important about recognizing the research and the evidence base to these ideas is that, for me at least, it allows me to trust what these tools and these strategies and these ideas are. All the things that we work on in Breaking Ground have about 20 years of research behind them, or a firm evidence base. So they're not random ideas that I've come up with or someone else has come up with. And as we go through the course, all those tools and ideas, we label them so that you can trace back where that originally comes from. And so if your curiosity is piqued about any one element of professional development that we talk about, you'll know how to find that research yourself, really. So that's what makes Breaking Ground, I think, different in the approach that we take, and what I think makes it particularly artist-centered. I find this to be the most relevant thing for me, myself personally, but also working with creatives when coaching one-to-one. It's these areas actually that produce and have produced the best effects and the best changes. So that's why I guess I'm coming from this perspective with this work. A little overview, briefly. On some career theory, which sounds boring, but I'll try and make it interesting. And the reason why we're going through this is because a lot of the old traditional ways of thinking about careers, we still have in our minds. They're not helpful. We still talk about them in arts policy, and that's not particularly helpful either. So we'll talk about the traditional ways, and we'll talk about the more modern ways and what is helpful in the newer ideas too. So here is a view of an old model based on some old ideas around career theory. So focus your attention here on this A line, which runs from past to sort of future via the present. And this is the way in which we thought about careers, and the way we sometimes still do. And this way of thinking about careers basically says, if we can identify some clear strengths and skills and preferences and give you the right training, then we can guarantee you a certain predictableness in your future. So if you've done the right training, you'll probably do well afterwards. And that's sort of guaranteed. It's a stable view of careers. The B line represents that on a more of a short-term focus. So the idea of, well, let's give somebody a certain amount of skill development, and that will give them this predictable sense of what to expect in the future. This is really reassuring to look at, and it feels quite nice and safe because it seems to guarantee a stability. This is some of the way in which we still think about careers. We still think about them as training, and then there should be this sense of this natural development that goes in an upward linear way right the way through my career. We talk about careers in the arts a little bit in this context too. The idea of early, mid, and late career artists reflects and comes from this idea too. And as we'll see in a little bit, that's become a little bit more redundant, really, especially for individual freelancers. Jumping forward to the 1980s, as more and more people began to work in ways that seemed quite freelance, attention of researchers went in the same direction. And so in the 80s, some excellent theorists by the name of Arthur and Rousseau did some studies into, well, what works well for people who are crossing networks and shifting their identities in relation to the roles they play. So what works well for essentially freelancers? And they came up with some excellent work, which they produced in what they call the Boundaryless Career. Now, there's a lot of information on this page. Don't feel like you have to take it all in. I'll talk us through some very briefly, some relevant pieces to it. In developing this particular research on this model, they looked at other industries that are traditionally freelance. And the one that they used specifically was the film industry in Hollywood in the 70s. And they interviewed lighting designers, writers, directors, actors, the whole lot, to say, well, what competencies need to be there for someone to develop a successful career in this kind of an environment? And we get this much bigger spectrum than we kind of imagine that's involved. Now, traditionally, we looked in these areas in relation to professional development. So the knowing what and the knowing where. So we would look at producing quality work quickly. How do you make things? How do you get exposure within the industry? How do you learn the ropes in that regard? Training is always crucial. So what can we do to enhance future options? Getting on the job experience, mentoring, that always ties into this type of traditional view of career development, and using portfolios to showcase skills. So these are all still part of the picture, all still needed and necessary. And it's great that we have structures in place around this. But as we can see, there's a lot missing from this thread of looking at freelance careers in the arts. Breaking Ground covers a bit more. So we nudge at these other areas, some of the areas that, like I said, are slightly more holistic, slightly more artist-centered that we might not have considered. So we know that the knowing why about why you're in your career is particularly important. So looking at the idea of, well, how do you keep that passion going without burning out? Balancing career and family. We look at it very much from the idea of, well, how do we incorporate career and family and all those other people that are important to us in our lives as we manage our professional development? Being genuine and strategic in relationships, shifting connections. That's a really important one to get our heads around, especially when we are moving between professions, moving between roles. That movement needs to be matched by the connections we're making as we go through that as well. So as a rough sort of overview, you can see there's a lot more in relation to what makes a freelance career work well that we typically look at. I'm just looking at reframing perceptions there. So breaking others' frames of reference of ourselves, but also I would say very much breaking our own reference of ourselves. A common thing that we've often heard creatives talk about, I'm sure we've all felt this, is that sense of sort of imposter syndrome. If you've, I don't know, been writing all your life and you suddenly want to move into directing, you might feel this sense of, well, who am I to be doing this? And that ties in with this idea of what's my personal reference point and how do I shift that? So Breaking Ground looks specifically at that as well. And of course, we cross over. So there's one or two places where the more traditional and Breaking Ground both meet. Here is the modern look of careers. So this comes from some research done by Robert Pryor and Jim Bright, and they looked at combining the chaos theory, which is how you experience and manage uncontrollable open systems like the weather, what works well in those environments, and they applied that theory towards creative careers. But they developed this view that you see in front of you of what the modern career looks like. Non-linear is a fair way of putting it, I would say. I showed this to some recent drama school graduates in London recently, having just come out of drama school during the pandemic, and the feedback was that, well, thank goodness there is something in print that defines what my experience has been like. And I think actually this replicates what my experience has been over the 20 years too. It certainly hasn't been linear. But there's ways to unpick this, actually, to understand what's going on here. So the A strand, that beautiful gray swirl, points towards the things that we know don't change about us over time. So there are core passions, core skills, core values that we hold over time that really kind of influence everything. And in Breaking Ground, we look at identifying them for ourselves. So there's parts of the old traditional way of looking at careers that is still useful. The B and C, that connect to that wonderful squiggle in the middle, those reference the idea of chance in our careers. Chance is a massive part of how our careers develop, whether we like it or not. And in Breaking Ground, we look at the idea of, well, how do we keep ourselves open to that? Not only open to it, but sort of acknowledging it and using it when it appears. The B and C offshoots point towards these things that are just unpredictable. We can't, in our creative careers, identify exactly where we're going to be, what we're going to need, or what our priorities are going to be 2 weeks down the line, 2 months down the line, or 2 years. So however we work with our careers needs to keep this more realistic version of them in mind. And that old cycle disappears here, that old cycle of early career, mid-career, late career artist is sort of out the window. And what we know about the way modern careers work, especially in the arts, is that that cycle is present, but happens maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of a lifetime. So I can be a late career poet, but an early career novel writer. So we know that we're constantly changing and shifting in that way. So to give us a bit of a brief overview of those 2 ways of looking at careers, so the older traditional view and the view that is more modern and the view that Breaking Ground works from specifically, because I feel like it's the most relevant for us. So the traditional view of careers looks at the idea of solving problems and finding a clear answer. So often when people come to career development or come to a career coaching session, they will want a specific answer. What is the key, the one key I need that will help my career progress? And there isn't one. There isn't one, because if there was, it would be outdated as soon as we discovered it, really. Really, it's about, well, how do we construct answers for ourselves over time? And we'll see a bit more about that. Choosing the best option often keeps us quite kind of stuck waiting to find out. And traditionally, the ways in which we have made decisions about our careers haven't always been from the most informed positions, actually. Sometimes they're more about gut instinct. And we look at that in Breaking Ground too. Tying up loose ends, clear goals and being certain. The idea of goals always irked me as a freelance actor, because I thought, well, with everything changing so much, so often, what use is having a clear goal? And I still feel that way a little bit. Here's the modern way or the modern suggestion of looking at careers. And this is the perspective that we take in Breaking Ground about moving forward. And it's because it's one that I feel to be more accurate and true, but it's also one that I've seen work so well for so many people that I've worked with one-to-one in coaching. So the modern view says it's less about solving a puzzle and more about exploring a mystery. It's about accepting the fact that things are changing, the things that are ahead of us we might not know, but the attitude we take towards that is actually quite crucial. So less about a fixed mindset of what is the one thing I need to do, and a more expansive, open one. Trying a strategy as opposed to finding an answer. This is a big part of Breaking Ground. In between each session that we do, there is a week, an opportunity to try strategies, to try things that you've heard and see how they work, or play with some ideas. We know that this creates a momentum in careers, and that's really what opens the door to so much change. Living with ambiguity. There are certain existential tensions about being a freelancer in the arts that aren't going anywhere, in the same way that there are certain existential tensions about being human that aren't going anywhere. And in Breaking Ground, we look a little bit at the idea of, well, we can't change them, but how do we manage them? Or how do at least we acknowledge them? Influencing systems. As an artist, we can often feel, I think, at the outside of the industry that we are meant to be a part of. We often talk about ourselves approaching gatekeepers who may or may not open the doors for us. And so often we find ourselves working in a way where we are outside of the place that we want to work in. Breaking Ground looks at it slightly differently. It says that, well, we are part of those systems. We are a part of a culture, part of a profession, part of an industry. And as part of it, we do always have some level of influence. Even if there's big barriers in the way, there's some level of influence. And Breaking Ground looks at our level of influence in each one of them and how we might extend them. And finally, fuzzy goals and embracing uncertainty. So we do need to have an idea of where we're going, but that doesn't have to be a fixed one. It can be a sense, it can be an idea, it can be a trajectory. It doesn't have to be a fixed goal attached to one particular outcome. So we look at goal management and those ideas specifically for freelancers and for creatives. What changes? And embracing uncertainty. We can't guarantee you'll embrace uncertainty at the end, but you'll, I hope, feel very different about it. So those are the two views of careers that we work on. And Breaking Ground, like I said, sits firmly in this modern view of it, which is why the ways in which we work are slightly different. Here is an overview of the whole project. So how it's broken down are 6 90-minute group sessions, so group workshops, covering each one of these particular subject titles, which I'll run through pretty quickly. So the first week we look at beginnings. So what's the fundamentals behind motivation? What's the important things we need to understand as creatives in order to be able to understand our own levels of motivation, what influences them, what's helpful, what's not. Sustaining habits, we'll look at a model in relation to that to help us identify where we are in relation to the changes we're trying to make. And that's really useful in identifying what's going to be helpful for us, or at least understanding the frustration we might feel when something isn't working straight away for ourselves. Goal setting for creatives, as I've already mentioned. The second one is around visions, which sounds quite sort of out there, but it isn't. It's about holistic career mapping. So we're not looking at career mapping from just an individual perspective, just me in my world doing my work. We look at it from the perspective of, well, actually, you are part of a society, you are part of a friendship group, a family. How do you want those two things to interplay? And how do we go about creating a context for our own careers when there isn't really one, aside from our own subjective one? And when that is lacking, we will often use the context of the most successful in our particular field, and we'll measure ourselves against them. And you don't need me to tell you how unuseful that might feel at times. We look at challenges. There's lots of challenges, of course, structurally in relation to funding and all of those wonderful things. But typically, actually, in working with people and from my own experience, a large proportion of the challenges we come across also come from more internal aspects. So the way I think about myself, how I work in the world, the beliefs I might have. So in that section, we look at how beliefs are formed so that they can be unpacked and unpicked. So if there's a clear sense that you have of, well, I can do A, but I'm not the kind of person who does B. B is a little step beyond me. That might not be grounded in any real sort of accurate truth. And so we look a little bit at unpicking those for ourselves and unpicking sort of distorted thinking. So, when we sit down to write our novel, what is that one thought that makes us go, yeah, I can't do this? That might be a distorted thought. It might not be true at all. You might have written several books, but just feel a little off on that day. So we look at a model to help us unpick that as well. Resources, looking at the idea of sustaining change over time, the best practice for creative practices. So what do we know from psychology about really helps us in establishing a creative practice? And then we do a wonderful World Cafe where as a group, we share the most relevant challenge that we have for us at that moment and get some solutions from the group. And that was, I think, one of my personal favorites from last year. Connections. We're not by ourselves, clearly, in the arts. And a big thing that comes up repeatedly is, well, how do I reach out and connect to others? And we unpick that a little bit. One, by funneling down the whole world of people we could contact into those who are maybe most relevant to what we want to do in our careers. But then looking at the psychology behind some of that communication. So where do I position myself in relation to others, and how might that be getting in the way even before I reach out? And finally, we look at reflections, which is about really putting some meaning on the whole process that we've had over the 6 weeks, but then looking about how we move forward specifically in relation to the embracing uncertainty. So solution-focused approaches come from solution-focused brief theories, which are really useful ways of how do we move forward when we don't know what's next, and ways of moving forward that don't necessarily dig into the problem that we might perceive as getting in the way. Actually, there's ways around those problems sometimes that often we don't necessarily think about. And like I said at the beginning, we can't have very specific ideas of our future in the arts. But what we do quite naturally is we do form metaphors about where we want to go. And working within a career metaphor can be a really useful way of finding a direction for ourselves, a sense of what we want to happen in the future for ourselves without being incredibly specific. So enough to guide us, but not enough to tether us. And the other elements of Breaking Ground, tying to these. So one is the narrative thread. So we send you a prompt before each session and after each session, which looks at the idea of identifying some of those resources, our own personal values, possible futures we might want to explore. And we look at it in relation to a personal narrative. And we do that because there's a lot of excellent research in narrative psychology around career development, using the idea of story. We naturally think about our careers as a story anyway, so it's a really useful way of working. But that brings a lot of the old way of thinking of careers into the modern one without being too boring, actually, and also being really useful. And we get all that information and we put it into a source document, or you will, so that when you leave, you will have just a 1 or 2 page outline of the most important values that you have, the resources that have worked really well for you in the past, some key elements of your own network, and what you're looking to do next. All of what we talked about, which is a lot, will fit into a PDF workbook as well. That'll have all the tools and strategies in there for you and explained, and there'll be some video tutorials in there as well if you're missing some of the nuance. So you get that workbook. And finally, not compulsory, but definitely up for grabs, is a one-to-one coaching session. And the reason why that's in here is because, like I said at the beginning, individual artists have varied goals and varied wants and needs. And I believe firmly that actually, unless we have a space to really explore those for ourselves with somebody else who's trained to help in that way, we miss some very crucial aspects of how we might move things forward. So I think that one-to-one coaching session could be used in relation to the things we've covered in the previous 6 weeks. It could be used in relation to a particular block you might have, or it could be used just to plan out in great detail for yourself what the next year you want it to look like, or whatever you want to use it for, really. So that's an overview of the whole project and the way it works and why. I'm just on the 31-minute mark, so we're running over slightly, but I've only got 2 more slides, so we're all good. Here is some of the feedback from last year's Breaking Ground. So yeah, have a little view of some of this yourself. I know when I reviewed this about 6 months ago, I was reminded that actually when we did Breaking Ground last year, it came, I think, March, April, May, same time last year. And that was I guess at the end of the third lockdown, really, or the beginning of the end of the last lockdown. And so I think it's a bit of a testament to the group that we had, and also the material that underpins Breaking Ground, that people left feeling, it's fair to say, positive, optimistic, and hopeful about their careers and what they could do. So the small changes that are mentioned there as well. So that's the experience of people who were there last year in a whittled down nutshell. So moving on then to our last part of this presentation, which is just the basics about the project. So here are our start date and our ending date. So Sunday the 6th of March to Sunday the 10th of April. It is on Sundays in the evening time. And we've done that because it can be a useful time that feels naturally reflective, but also the beginning of a week. So it's a really good time often for us to be available, but also to be able to think about that next week and where we might want to apportion some time to flip through some of these ideas. The price for the whole Breaking Ground is 150. And Gartlane has informed me that there's an early bird offer, a limited amount of tickets going for 125 as well. I will, in a moment, stop recording and stop sharing, and I will pop in a little link into the chat box so that you can use that link to purchase a ticket if you wish to, or just go to the Gartlane website as well.